Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to the first of a three-part webinar series on how to build a public broadband network, sponsored jointly by the American Association for Public Broadband and the Benton Institute for Broadband Society. I'm Gigi Sohn, the Executive Director of AAPB. Today's webinar is titled Making the Community Broadband Network Decision. The webinar series is an outgrowth of an AAPB and Benton Institute publication titled Own Your Internet, How to Build a Public Broadband Network. Let me talk a little bit for 1 minute about what AAPB is and what we do. We're a nonprofit trade association representing broadband networks across the United States that are controlled and owned by local communities and their residents. AAPB believes that communities should be free to choose the communications networks that best meet the needs of their residents. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter and other announcements at aapb.us. And please, if you can, join. We are a membership organization. I want to thank the Benton Institute for being a great partner in this whole endeavor, and in particular, Adrienne Furness, Revati Prasad, and Reed Sharkey. Thank you also to the speakers today for taking your time to do this. And finally, a huge thanks, a huge shout out to the author of the handbook and moderator of this webinar, Bill Coleman of Community Technology Advisors. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you and take it away.
Thank you so much, Gigi. I really appreciate the opportunity to work with AAPB and produce the handbook. Good day, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As Gigi mentioned, this is the first of 3 webinars, and we'll be talking about the second webinar coming up in May towards the end of the program. But today we're focused on making the public broadband decision. We'll discuss the many possible paths, not always straightforward, that communities might take to make this significant decision on an important but human and fiscal resource intensive effort. Our 4 presenters have a combined wealth of experience in the critical skill sets required to launch this type of community initiative: technology, sales and marketing, coalition building, and politics. If you've not yet downloaded the handbook, you can find it on the AAPB website. We hope that it helps you on your community broadband journey. As I mentioned, our next webinar is May 14th at noon. The registration link is on the AAPB website. But let's get going. I'm going to introduce all 4 of our panelists, and then let each of them speak for a few minutes to talk about their own community broadband story. Then we'll get into some questions and panel discussion. I'm going to introduce all 4, and then we'll go to the presentations. First up will be Ellie DeVeers. Ellie is Executive Director of Maple Broadband in Addison County, Vermont. She has both a strong and international background in telecom and technology. She attended Babson's F.W. Olin Graduate School of Business. According to our LinkedIn page, she loves doing right by customers, innovation, value identification, and capture. Her strengths are creativity and bridging the gap between the technical and the commercial. Following Ellie will be Cynthia Garza. For more than 8 years, Cynthia has been Director of External Relations for the city of Pharr, Texas, which is on the South Texas border. Prior to this role, she was a congressional staff person serving as district director. She graduated from Texas A&M before receiving her MPA from University of Texas Pan American. Jeff Ryman is president of the Broadband Group. He brings a wealth of understanding and experience in technology, capital market structure, and entrepreneurship to assist clients to advance broadband network deployments and Internet of Things implementation strategies for cities and large-scale development projects. He's a Harvard grad and worked in the Boston office of Credit Suisse Investment Bank on the equities and sale trading floor, and also Wave 7 Optics, a fiber-to-the-home equipment supplier. And finally, Krista Thorpe she's a community development officer working with the Island Institute Center for Sustainable Communities to support Maine's island and coastal communities in achieving equitable, high-speed internet connectivity. A graduate of Wheaton College, Krista has a BA in anthropology and an MA in intercultural studies. Prior to joining the Island Institute, she worked as an educator in Chicago, Bangladesh, and Maine. Quite a list there. So welcome, thank you all to all of our speakers. Ellie, why don't you take the lead and tell us about your work in Vermont?
All right, thank you so much. So I think there are some slides that we're going to put up. If you can go to the next one, that's just the title slide. So, Maple Broadband is one of 10 communications union districts in the state of Vermont. So this is a map of the state of Vermont, obviously with the communications union districts listed. So we are municipal entities, instrumentalities of states, and we are formed by member towns voting to join a union district. So we're essentially public broadband districts, like a water district or a sewer district. And what we're doing is we are building fiber optic service out to the last mile. So some of you on the call may recognize EC Fiber over on the right. That is the original CUD. They formed over a decade ago in a very different environment and grew quite organically. And I actually heard of EC Fiber for the first time when I was living and working in Africa as an example of an innovative community-centric approach to connecting the unconnected. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please. So this is my district. This is Maple Broadband. So we have 20 member towns in the county of Addison in Vermont. That's a total of about 17,000 addresses. And when we first started the project in 2022, we had just under 6,000 addresses that were or underserved. And that was according to the definition in Vermont's Act 71, which was addresses that were lacking service at 25.3. So it's again, it's actually questionable as to whether or not services receiving 25.3 are actually considered to be served. Obviously, the broadband definition has been updated, but that just gives a sense. So about a third of the addresses that we had didn't even have 25.3. And you see over there the map. So we have partnered, we're a public-private partnership. So essentially as Maple Broadband, we're building the fiber optic network, and we've partnered with a local ILEC telephone company called Waitsfield and Champlain Valley Telecom. So they are our network operator and our internet service provider. So they operate our service on our behalf. And approximately half of the road miles and passings in our district are part of their ILEC footprint. And so part of our strategy is to partner with them, whereby we're both building fiber at the same time. So they're building half of it and we're building half of it. So as of now, we have 163.9 miles of lit service, just under 2,000 passings. And of those passings, 1,168 lacked 25.3 when we started. So that shows some sense of our impact that we have by design started with the unserved and underserved portions of our districts. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of detail about what communications union districts are. I said a little bit of this earlier, but just to recap here. So CUDs are organized as a result of towns voting to join the CUD. And this is quite an important aspect because each town then appoints a delegate and an alternate to participate in the governance of the CUD on the governing board. And that direct connection that we have with the towns is obviously very helpful in terms of making sure that we're actually hearing from everyone what is important in their area versus making decisions that are a little bit divorced from what the public might want and need. And so as CUDs, we're all committed to universal service. This is one of the requirements of grant funding that we received as part of Act 71 of 2021, which was the state of Vermont decided to dedicate some ARPA funding to preferentially to communications union districts in order to reach the last mile, recognizing the historic market failure of the private companies. And in fairness to the private companies, when you're dealing with very rural areas, in some cases, there may not actually be a business case. And even where there is, it's a difficult thing when there's an opportunity cost and you could choose to build a mile in a denser area, potentially in the state of Vermont or in another states. It's very difficult for rural to come to the top of the list. So that was what the state of Vermont was addressing most recently in Act 71 by creating the Vermont Community Broadband Board, which is our broadband office, and the Vermont Community Broadband Fund, which I mentioned earlier. But the support of CUD started even earlier in the state of Vermont In 2015, there was a law that enabled the creation of CUDs, essentially to facilitate EC Fiber being able to go to the revenue bond market. And then in 2019, there was some seed funding provided to help CUDs kickstart with feasibility studies. So an important other aspect about CUDs is under Vermont law, we are prohibited from taxing residents of member towns. And so our sources of funding are grants, loans, and any private capital that we can receive. We can also, and that would include placing municipal bonds, which have to be revenue bonds because they can't be general obligation bonds. So we're public entities and have everything that goes along with that in terms of governance, transparency, and accountability. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie. That was great. Great introduction. Next, we'll go to Cynthia Garza Reyes.
Hi, good morning, everybody. If you're in Central Time, my name is Cynthia Garza Reyes, and I'm the Director of External Relations for the City of FAR, located in the most southern point of Texas, down in what we call the Rio Grande Valley along the Texas-Mexico border. So just a little bit about our project overview before we really dive into it. Our project started literally in 2015 with a new commission, a very progressive commission and mayor that came in. It started with a simple discussion with our largest school district in FAR that literally houses close to 38,000 students. And out of those, about 14,000 of those students are City of FAR residents. So when we learned that a lot of our students were actually sitting on the steps of our schools at 8, 9 o'clock at night just to try to do their homework, it was unacceptable at the time. They were literally staying at Burger King's until 10, 11 o'clock at night, having to pay to get something just so that they could use their Wi-Fi there. And so at the same time, there was actually a report that came out through the there was a report that came out that basically highlighted what we call colonias in our area. And those are communities that lack the needs of wastewater treatment, literally electricity, and so on. And FAR, the City of FAR, was a very large proponent of that. And so because of that, it showed that we needed to close that gap. And so we decided to work together in collaboration with our school districts to begin with the feasibility study. We actually then started an actual pilot study as well, where we took 50 families. We gave them actual devices, and we basically studied them, for the first phase. Then we went into a second phase where we actually gave them the skills. We taught them the usage of the internet and so on. And COVID hit us. And so by the time COVID hit, we were literally able to expedite our project to where now we have at least close to 90% of the city with actual, fiber optic cable underneath. And so with that, we've been able to literally become a role model, not only for our region, but for Texas as well, and for the nation as well. And so what we're doing is we've gone beyond the middle mile. We decided to go to the last mile, to where each household has the ability to not only connect at a minimum of 500 megabytes, but at a 1 gigabyte as well. So we are in the middle of full outreach within our communities. If you go to the next slide, just to kind of show you, you see where the little dot is on the bottom. That is where we're located. And unfortunately, that is also a stat that we had in 2019. So within that process, that is when we were literally finishing our feasibility studies and so on, in order to line up everything. While we were going through this process in terms of studies, we were also doing a lot of outreach on the state level and on the federal level. If you were to look at prior to 2020, and if you were to look at policy that was out there for broadband, there wasn't a lot. And the policy that was out there, unfortunately, did gear more towards rural type communities. You're talking about 20,000 and below. And unfortunately, FAR was in the position where we weren't small enough, we weren't rural enough, but then we weren't as large as our metropolitan areas that could really compete for funding. We're a community of 80,000 individuals with a household income of, on average, 38,000 a year. And so because of that, we knew that when we were looking at what the city wanted to do, we knew that the only way to have a price point that would be affordable for our community, not only short term but long term, we had to own our network. And so that's what we decided to do. That is what worked for FAR. We're kind of a unicorn right now because, like I said, we started our project during COVID, and because of that, our commission decided to take advantage of the low interest rates. So our project is funded through a mix of revenue bonds along with ARPA funding that the city received as well. But it has been amazing so far. If you were to look at the same map, unfortunately now, all of a sudden you would see that there are 28 providers in FAR. But unfortunately, because we are boots on the ground right now, we know that that is not the case. And so our community, every day, we see anywhere between 40 to 50 installations a day. Last month, we had an average of 744 installations in 1 month. So our goal is to get to the 800 mark. And our goal is to have 40% of our households connected by June, and it seems like we're probably going to surpass that. In terms of price ability, what we do is for 500 megabytes, they can receive that for $25. So if they were under the ACP program, they essentially would get that for free and use an additional dollars towards an additional mesh. And then we have the 1 gigabyte available for $50. And so far, it's been fantastic. We love our project and we're ready to share it with whoever would like to listen. Thank you so much.
Cynthia, thank you so much for that. That's really inspiring. And people say, oh, isn't FAR lucky to have that? But you can just hear the planning and the vision that went into the decision to address the digital equity issues in your community. So great. I want to encourage people, if they have questions or comments, to put those in the chat, and we'll collect those as we go and answer those as we go through the program. So thank you so much. Next up is Jeff Ryman, and welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Bill. Pleasure to be here today. The Broadband Group consultant advisory firm headquartered out of Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm in our Denver office where our engineering resources are located today. The Broadband Group, we are proud members of the American Association for Public Broadband and supporters for all that the Benton Institute provides for our industry, because the information and the advocacy that is provided is so important. Those that are considering a path forward in a municipally led broadband initiative, the more research you do in the broadband industry, you might find that the more that is understood, the more seemingly complex the industry presents itself as. When you think of the regulatory, the legal, the financial, the technical, the surprisingly fiercely competitive nature of this industry, you might find that there are going to be far greater opportunities for challenges than there are for success. But as we all know too well, the importance of connectivity has never been clear. And the resources that AAPB is so important. And understanding what the right path forward is for your specific community, because I promise you, unfortunately, there's no off-the-shelf solution. As we say at the Broadband Group, there's no map in place, but the compass is there. And that's the role that AAPB is playing, and we're happy to support it. When thinking about what a path forward might be for any local municipal leadership, I think there can also be great value in looking back. Next slide, please. To help demystify this industry, I think it's relevant to demonstrate that this is not a technology de jour in terms of a fiber network deployment. This isn't an entrepreneurial experiment. Deploying fiber optic infrastructure to advance the economic future of a region is something that dates back to 1985 in Central Florida. There was 2 deployments at that time. There was the Hunters Creek deployment and Heathrow, which were both right in the Central Florida geographic area. The Heathrow project is what I will speak to. It was championed by a gentleman named Gino Paolucci. Some may recognize that name, some may not. Gino Paolucci had a food empire, a Chungking Chinese food, and Gino's Pizza Rolls, which he sold to Pillsbury. They became Totino's Pizza Rolls. Well, Gino Paolucci wanted to build a new development project there in Central Florida, but the problem is no one lived there and no one really had reason to live there. So the development team, which you see there, which to the right is a gentleman named Dick Snelling, Executive Vice President of Bell South. To Gino's left is Tom Ryman, my late father and founder of the Broadband Group. And they recognize in order to attract businesses, in order to attract an area where people want to live, there has to be a connection in terms of the way in which they communicate and where they want to be based. So they put plans together for what became the industry's first fiber to the home deployment. With that network in place, they wanted to prove the model. They went and heard from the American Automobile Association, AAA, which announced that they were relocating their corporate headquarters from Falls Church, Virginia, and they were looking for a location in somewhere in Florida or somewhere in Texas. Well, when the Heathrow development team got wind of this, they sat with AAA. They talked about the fiber optic infrastructure that was in place there. Now, again, this is the mid-'80s. So they were looking at the fiber optic infrastructure for more secure, more reliable voice calls. Well, AAA realized that at their core, they're a communications company, 1-800-AAA-HELP. And they saw that this fiber optic network could lead to more secure, more reliable, higher quality voice calls that came into their corporate headquarters. Well, for a number of reasons, but also because of that fiber optic infrastructure, AAA picked Heathrow as their North American headquarters. It transformed the economics of Central Florida. Today, when you call 1-800-AAA-HELP, you're likely calling their headquarters there at the Heathrow Development Project. And I think that's important because as we were planning for this call, a question was raised, well, what comes first for municipal leaders? Is it a vision? Or is the hard data showing that it can actually be sustainable? And of course, there's going to be a combination of the two, but it starts with a clear vision and great leadership. And when I talk about leadership, I'm not talking about hierarchy, of course. I'm talking about capabilities and mindset in terms of accomplishing what we know needs to get done, which is getting that advanced connectivity infrastructure for the benefit of the residents and the businesses of your region. When talking about the complexity of this industry, I think it's also relevant to quote Gino Paolucci, because Gino wasn't a technologist. He wasn't a futurist. He was a successful business person. Next slide, please. And what Gino said was, I don't know the first thing about fiber optics, but I know what people need. And I know the most important thing we do is communicate. And that's what this is all about. Getting the advanced connectivity infrastructure in place that advances the social, the healthcare, the education, the commerce of your region. And again, that's why we are supporters of AAPB and look forward to providing the information that will hopefully lead to the successful municipally led deployments throughout the country. Next slide. When talking about the tactical approaches to be aware of when thinking about a path forward, there's some key steps there. First is the business structure options. What role do we want to play? We just heard from Far Texas, recognizing they wanted to both own and I understand operate the network. There's the opportunity to simply own the infrastructure and then find service providers to come on and take on the responsibility of delivering those services. Or is it better positioned for your community to facilitate some form of public-private partnership or alignment? I emphasize that when talking about this industry, you have to be careful how you use the term partnership. We're all aware there are some state laws in place that restrict the alignment that a local municipality, a public municipality can have with any one service provider. So I use the term public-private partnership loosely. And then understanding, well, how do we want to get this network designed? The way in which the electronics will be positioned will be a distributed split architecture, a centralized split architecture. We don't need to go in the details of that, but just to be aware that it's not simply placing wires on a pole, there's a lot of complications that go into and considerations that go into designing and deploying a network that isn't impossible, but of course just must be understood and addressed. What is the best deployment for our region? Is it aerial? Is it underground? Both, introducing their own benefits and potential challenges during the construction process. And then I must emphasize the importance of market research. Of course, when you ask your community what is needed, they'll say we need better broadband, we need competitive broadband. But when putting together the business plan, the reality is that subscribers take longer to switch, even when introduced with a higher quality service at a lower price. It takes longer to switch than what most pro formas might incorporate, in potentially introducing financial challenges if that market research isn't done to really help give a better understanding of what the take rates will be over time. The importance of investment grade financials. I emphasize at the Broadband Group our financial models, and I don't say this to be intimidating, I say it to introduce the importance of understanding the various levels of planning that must be done, which AAPB is going to educate on. The investment grade financials that the Broadband Group puts together has 3,000 rows of assumptions, 3,000. Now, of course, that has categories with subcategories in it, but if you switch or modify any one of those rows of assumptions, could effectively change whether a path forward will be successful or whether it could potentially be terminal. Understanding what all those inputs are going to be very important and be able to confidently move forward with a path. And then when you decide to move forward with that path, when challenged on why you're moving forward on that path, you're able to defend it. You're able to defend it with the market research, the investment grade financials that have been put in place. And then finally, I always like to emphasize, I don't want it to be missed, that when you do choose to go forward on a plan in whatever capacity it is, the construction inspection process is something that's critically important, making sure the networks that get designed properly. It's what leads to a more longer lasting infrastructure, one that lasts decades versus one that might have to be repaired if not properly constructed from the offset. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. That was really great guidance there. Gino Paolucci is a legend here in Minnesota, and his work to decide to put a Chinese food manufacturing company in Duluth, Minnesota is still talked about. So thanks for that story and the quote. It was great. And then finally, Krista, welcome from Maine.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Gigi, for hosting this conversation. To Ellie and Cynthia and Jeff, I just learned so much. Thanks for all you're doing to empower communities. My name is Krista Thorpe, and I'll be sharing some examples from Maine where I lead Island Institute's community-driven broadband program, which includes our role as one of 13 regional broadband partners working with the Maine Connectivity Authority to help write and implement the state's first digital equity plan. Next slide. Just a little background on the Island Institute. We are a 40-year-old nonprofit organization serving Maine's 150 coastal communities. This includes 15 remaining year-round unbridged island communities, several of which have chosen to build public broadband networks, as I'll share more about in a bit. But along with a strong and committed network of partners across the state and beyond, we are addressing some really big challenges facing Maine's waterfront communities right now, with a focus on empowering strong leaders, developing climate solutions, and creating resilient economies. Our broadband work, which I've been involved with since the beginning of 2019, but we've been doing since 2016, grew out of that economic development priority. But viewers here today probably agree with me that broadband enables progress in all three of these areas. For example, we're looking at how to cultivate strong leaders through increased civic engagement and educational opportunities, and advancing climate solutions through smart connected grids and the option of remote work to reduce carbon emissions. Next slide. Please don't worry about reading all the small print on this graphic, but it's meant to show how Maine has tried to build a broadband ecosystem that centers equity and creates a constant feedback loop between the state government and Maine's internet users and advocates. So since 2016, as I mentioned, Island Institute has been working at both state and local levels to strengthen Maine's broadband infrastructure. And we were a founding member of the Maine Broadband Coalition, which is a grassroots network of organizations that have been coming together for nearly a decade and helped pave the way for the creation of the Maine Connectivity Authority in 2021. And that's the quasi-governmental state agency that's deploying all of the federal broadband funding coming to Maine. Next slide. Over several years of working with Maine's rural communities, truly with a focus on those remote coastal and islands, Island Institute has discovered a pattern of how communities approach the challenge of obtaining broadband infrastructure. We developed a community-driven broadband process model to help guide community leaders through the steps for bringing broadband to their own towns and residents. This started as a series of basic worksheets that we used to facilitate committee meetings locally. And the first time we actually brought them together as a complete guidebook, which I'll share the link to later, was in 2019 for the Maine Broadband Summit, where actually, Bill, you were a keynote speaker. So it's really exciting to me that today's webinar is related to the great handbook Bill has developed, which provides so much more depth and detail specifically on building public broadband networks. Our process guide is a wheel because we believe communities can jump in at almost any stage. And the guide uses storytelling and practical worksheets to meet communities where they are in determining the best solution for bringing universal access to residents. Most importantly, and this I think will come up a lot today, the process relies on deep community engagement for ultimate success and return on investment. It's not surprising that several communities we've worked with that went through this planning process ultimately did decide to build public or community-owned broadband networks. Next slide. I'm proud to share today and do my best to represent their experiences that 18 Maine communities so far have made the decision to build public networks with a variety of models in play. The first 5 listed here are in order of when they were built and operational starting in 2018 with Maine's first broadband utility district, similar to the CUD that were described earlier in Vermont. And we also had 2 unbridged island municipalities, Islesboro and the Cranberries, all operational as of 2018. The next 2 on the list, Cliff Island and Georgetown, aren't technically public, but they are funded by community investors that formed an LLC and were motivated by public benefit rather than private profits. And then the last 6 italicized communities are in various stages of the make-ready process, getting their public networks up and running, but all are expected to be live and operational within a year. So it's exciting time to be in Maine right now, but it's also challenging, and I'm sure some of those challenges will come up through this series. These projects are all unique, but they do share a common story driven by the fact that most of these communities are very small, very rural and remote, making broadband truly a lifeline. And I'll look forward to sharing more about what went into their decisions as we continue the discussion. Next slide just has my contact info. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Krista. That was great. That's really inspiring to see what's happened in Maine and the kind of steady progress you've made in a very beautiful but rugged part of the United States. So thank you for joining us today. We're going to get into some questions and answers now. And really the first one I'd like to address is this question of, is this a matter of analysis or is this a matter of vision that drives these community processes forward? Obviously, both are required, but the chicken and the egg kind of thing. Is it a matter of the need and the demand, or is it a matter of vision about economic prosperity and so on? Krista, why don't you've worked with a lot of community leaders.
I will jump in and echo Jeff in saying that community vision really needs to be at the heart of the entire process. Again, no matter where you jump into that process. The top piece of advice shared with me recently by Georgetown's broadband champion is that you need to know your community, know what you're comfortable with, how you typically tackle projects, what your strengths are, what the resources at hand are. And it may be that you need some hard data to even begin answering those questions, but getting your community to come together around a goal right from the outset can really prevent stallouts, a lot of which we've seen during a whole bunch of other decision points along the journey. And the goal can be as simple as, this is a common one used, we want universal access to affordable, future-proof, high-speed internet for our community. Gets a little clunky, but every community I've known who's used that has ended up, really making their decisions, keeping their decisions focused on that goal. And then one last point on data, for really small remote communities, it can be hard to even get accurate data because some of these islands have 30 year-round residents. If the census doesn't get more than 10 responses from a community, that data gets thrown out. So just one example there.
Good. Good. And thanks for the great questions that are coming online. We really appreciate those. We're going to, as we go through the process, we'll answer some of those, and then we'll bundle up the remainders at the end to respond. So thank you so much for that. Cynthia, why don't you talk about your process? And you talked a little bit about that originally, but what came together where digital equity came so quickly to the forefront, and who took the lead?
So I think for the city, it's very unique because there were different synergies that were going on at the same time. When this report came out from the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, it had actual data attached to it. And yet at the same time, we were having our own discussions with our school districts as well. So it then became a vision of the city that this was going to be one of their major priorities. And so when we partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, we had initial data to start with. As we continued through the actual process itself, we knew that if there was any potential for any type of funding later on down the line, we had to have the initial data, but actual feasibility studies attached as well. Throughout this whole process, too, the city became a very data-driven community in terms of when it came to our capital projects. We did actual surveys within our communities every year in terms of ranking what was important to our communities, finding out who had broadband, who didn't, and so on. And so we used a lot of that to basically create the foundation of our project. We had to show the need. The middle mile feasibility study did that as well for us, not only in terms of the financial side, but really examining what was out there in the field as well. And so it was definitely a little bit of both. In terms of who drove the project, the city did drive that project, but we did have a lot of community partners at the same time. The city of FAR is home to 5 school districts. And so with the one school district being PSJ ISD, they're the largest technically. They were our main partner, but we also made sure that we had partnerships with our local banks, our local hospitals, because a part of that vision was making sure that we also created outlets for our community residents in terms of potential telehealth, potential financial literacy, things like that. So it was important that we had the private sector on board as well. And of course, with our public entity being the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas.
Great, thank you for that. Jeff? Well, you're muted, Jeff, I think.
When thinking about both vision and data, as well as a very clear need, I'm reminded of Huntsville, Alabama. It was Mayor Tommy Battle who at the time back in 2016, made the claim that Huntsville is going to become a gigabit city, but there was no real clear path of how Huntsville would accomplish that. At the same time, the electric utility recognized that they needed more fiber optic infrastructure within their network, the city-owned electric utility, in order to advance their grid of the future agenda, their smart grid thesis. So the idea was, with a vision of advancing the connectivity needs, the internal operational needs of that utility, while then also, in a way, supporting the vision that was championed by Mayor Tommy Battle, the utility lease model was born, where a network was built first and foremost for the purposes of advancing the internal operational needs of that utility. All the thesis of smart grid technologies, not just technologies de jure, but the ones that can be anticipated are going to be introduced over the next decades. I'm not an expert on smart grids, but what I do know is the smart grid is essentially a more intelligent grid. Intelligence, which is enabled by technologies placed on the grid, and those technologies best communicate when there's fiber optic infrastructure in place. So with that vision and that need in place, the utility built their network for themselves with excess capacity that was made available on a non-exclusive basis to anchor tenant and now multiple tenants who utilize that infrastructure to advance the connectivity capabilities of the residents and the businesses throughout the city of Huntsville. So great leadership, clear vision, a defined need, and then a structured and disciplined approach is what leads to these type of successful municipally led initiatives.
Great. Thank you for that. That's a great answer. You know, we talk about leadership sometimes in the singular, but I think there's great teams that are involved on these projects, teams of community leaders that are in place with that. Cynthia, who was on your team in FAR? Was that city staff or was that a variety of the community members?
So the vision, of course, is led by our city commission and by our mayor. But those that took the lead was city staff. We had our IT director who took the lead in terms of the techie side. This became one of my special projects in terms of planning out that map. A lot of it is because of my background in policy. And at the end of the day, it was having a project ready to go that could be potentially funded by a grant. So the city took a lead on a lot of it. When we first started this project, we had a lot of internal meetings with our partners, but it was definitely city driven.
Okay, thank you. Ellie, your organization's been around for some time. Can you talk about the role of your board in terms of leading your efforts?
Absolutely. So as I covered earlier, our governing board is comprised of a delegate from every member town, as well as alternates as well. So the delegates can vote and the alternates are there and can provide thoughts on governance. And then we also have an executive committee. And so we've actually been really lucky. I mean, actually, just the last question you were asking in terms of leadership and skills, we were very lucky. I actually started off on the governing board and I was on the executive committee as a volunteer before I came on as staff. I'm the first staff member that Maple Broadband hired. And I, of course, had a broadband background, and our chair had an inside plant background. And then we had someone as well on the executive committee, and she had a financing background. And so we actually had a really nice trifecta right there of the kinds of skills and experience. But I think the governing board also provides, as I said earlier, provides that direct connection to the towns to make sure that we're not just sitting in an ivory tower making decisions that don't really reflect the ground truth of what people want. And again, being a local organization, some of that does come to us, but of course we do miss things. But then just like any nonprofit or for-profit, a good board acts as a sounding board. They have ideas, and then they can also provide additional resources as and where we need.
Okay, great. Thank you. Krista, anything to add to that?
Our process guide has just a short list for any, again, smaller community looking to have that wide representation as they get started on planning. So you need a municipal official or someone with political will. There will be funding required along the way. An educator, librarian, or someone who cares about educational opportunities. Someone who interacts with a wide range of the community, just that person at the general store, just the person that everyone knows. A telecommuter or someone who really depends themselves on broadband. And then someone from business or industry that's important to the community. So, in a coastal community, can you get a fisherman on this committee, and not make them sit through a whole bunch of meetings, but make sure that they're part of the process, so that you have your whole community represented.
Okay. And as I always look at the clock, time is always so fleeting on these sessions. I'm wondering about the opposition. There's lots of questions around opposition to these projects from broadband providers, community members. How do you deal with that kind of opposition? And I think Jeff talked a little bit about having that hard data in place to show that this is a positive project that will be successful. Jeff, any follow-up to that? And then let's kind of move through folks if they have a comment on that.
Just know that opposition will come, whether it's through a legal regulatory approach or just through introduced competition. You can be in a region that has not received any investment by the incumbent providers. As soon as that first competitive dollar is made, that's when funds will be opened up to offer your residents and businesses a higher quality service or just a lower price service. We'll work to lock in contracts so that, again, your business model takes longer to come to fruition on the opportunity that maybe it does not come to fruition because enough revenues don't come on. So there's going to be multiple ways in which opposition is going to be introduced. So the only thing you cannot be is surprised by it. But the more data that you have in place, again, so that you can defend and confidently move forward with your path, recognizing that, again, the importance of connectivity is so important that the local region can't leave it up to whether or not it meets the investment thesis of a service provider, that we're going to take control of our connectivity future by moving forward on this path. There's the opportunity to align with the incumbents. You have the opportunity to align with competitive service providers. There's the opportunity to make those investments on your own, but understanding you will face opposition and being prepared for it is the most important thing that you can do.
Good, thank you. Cynthia, you're right in process now of what's been the response of the incumbent providers to your network deployment?
So when we initially started this project, the goal was to potentially partner with a private entity. And so that's where we started. But unfortunately, because of the economic income, the average income that was in our area, nobody wanted to partner with the city. Nobody wanted to come in and potentially provide broadband for our community. And so that is one of the main reasons why we decided to go the route that we did. Now that we're fully invested, we are at 90% of our implementation. There have been bumps along the road, and those bumps have come obviously with the amount of funds that have now come through the federal government and then via the state. We live in a state where, they prefer P3s, and we're just not a P3 project. And so were there roadblocks put up technically within the state when it came to potential funding mechanisms rolling through? Yes, there were. But that is a lot of why we had started our project a lot earlier and made the investments that we did. We did not want anybody to stop us from getting to the goal of connecting our projects, because for us, it was a lot bigger than just making sure households had broadband. It was about long-term affordability. We didn't want to just put a Band-Aid on the project that would be ripped off after funding was gone. We wanted to make sure that they were connected 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So now we're literally in the process of doing door-to-door outreach. We have a team of 30 individuals that literally go door-to-door Monday through Sunday. Basically, we have a team that goes out in the morning, in the afternoon. And do we see opposition in the street? We definitely do right now. But at the end of the day, the private entity just cannot compete with where we have our pricing right now and the speed that we're at. And so, yes, do we have private entities offering free telephones and free t-shirts, you name it, 3 months free of everything? Yes, we do. But at the end of the day, we believe in our service. We believe in what the vision was, and it speaks for itself.
Good. Thank you for that. So it's interesting, a lot of times we think about these networks taking place in cities, but they also have now, especially in rural, in New England, we're seeing large parts of rural areas being served with broadband. Ellie, Krista, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Maybe Ellie go first about just the challenges of the rural network.
Sure. Well, I think the most obvious challenge of a rural network is just the basic economics, like Jeff was talking about. And especially if you have a rural network and then the incumbent decides to wake up and say, oh, actually, I kind of liked this monopoly. Let me go in here and build fiber really quickly because I can probably overlash in my existing DSL, and I can maybe use other areas where I have density and greater profitability in order to compete on price and offer the free things that the city of FAR is seeing. I mean, that's, competition is tough everywhere, but it's especially tough when the underlying unit economics are more challenging. But I think Cynthia answered that well. Stick to the knitting, stick to the value proposition, make sure people understand. Back, as Krista said, that community vision is important for alignment and making sure that to the degree possible that the community buys in upfront, and if they're finding out about it later, just make sure they understand why you're doing this and what's in it for them, even if you're a little bit more expensive. And then I think some of the other things.
Talk a little bit about I'm sorry to interrupt, but your partnership with your telecom provider, the service provider.
Yeah, sure. So we have a partnership. So as I said earlier, we essentially build the infrastructure, and then we have partnered with a private existing ISP, and they provide the call center and the back office services, and the the OSS, BSS, the billing systems, and the internet service provision. And that was one of the reasons for that, of course, is that not to say that we couldn't do it ourselves, but the step function and cost to go from 0 subscribers to 1 subscriber is really, really big. And it also makes sense to leverage that existing expertise. And in the case of our partner, they've been around for 100+ years, locally owned, and they had a very good reputation for customer service. And I think that by the way, that local control, local ownership, local call center, that comes through again and again and again as one of the differentiators that we see. And just one other quick point about the rural challenges is that we've seen this as well in the uptake of the unfortunately likely moribund affordable connectivity program, but rural areas in general didn't see the uptake of the urban areas. And one of the reasons is that it's just people are when people are living in rural areas, there's a transportation problem. In order to reach them in person, you need to meet them somewhere. And so if you're going door to door, it takes longer, it's more expensive, and there's just fewer opportunities to get people in groups to be able to educate them about digital equity initiatives or broadband services.
Krista, anything to add to that?
Just that the take rate in every public network that we've supported far surpassed what the original projections were. And so, of course, incumbents are nervous, and we've absolutely seen some big money opposition from incumbent providers in tiny towns that could never stand up to it. But those who have been able to overcome it, it's because of, once again, deep community engagement work that also leads to that take rate and that ROI.
Okay, good. Cynthia, do you want to talk about how your community handles, obviously you're in your community, a lot of Spanish speakers, multilingual marketing, customer service. How have you dealt with all those things?
So if you look at the Rio Grande Valley and FAR itself, at least 90% of our population is Spanish speaking. Bilingual. A lot of them are bilingual as well. So within our plan, we had to make sure that we hired not only on the technical operations side, but also on our outreach side. We needed, and customer service. These 3 areas, we needed to make sure that we were hiring individuals that, 1, looked like our community, and 2, were able to speak to our community. So they had to be bilingual. And so down here, that's really not an issue down here. And so if you were to go into South FAR, where's the area that had the least connectivity, the majority of are Spanish speaking. So those individuals, whether they're involved in the operational side, the outreach side or the customer service side, they're all bilingual. And so there really isn't an issue there. And we made sure that we covered it as well. And that I think also is really important. You know, you have to know your community, you have to know your audiences. We've shared our model with other border towns, other communities, even Native American tribes, and that's one thing that we really talk to, that they've also brought up in terms of customer service. Sometimes there's communities that don't have bilingual individuals, and so that's where potentially, if you do have a community that has that, you have the ability to help serve others as well.
Okay, great. We're going to go back to Ellie for a follow-up on the partnership model.
Yeah, there was a question in the chat I wanted to address just about the revenue split. So when customers receive a bill, the bill comes from Maple Broadband. So the customer income comes to us, and then we pay our service partner. We pay them a fixed fee per month per customer, and the fee has a little bit of a differential based on the service speed to account for the increased bandwidth that the higher speeds consume.
Good, thank you. Jeff, any models you see in that private partnership that you'd want to showcase here in the last minute or so?
Well, I'll just emphasize that what is being deployed in Huntsville has been deployed in Huntsville, Springfield, both networks successfully completed, 1,000-mile networks each passing about 110,000 residents. What's being deployed in Colorado Springs, it's not a partnership. It is a network built by the utility with a tenant on that network. There's no shared risk in terms of market share by the utility. They have no visibility on whether the tenants on their network get 100% market share or 0% market share. The payments that are made to that utility are made on a fixed, predefined monthly basis. It's not a partnership. We say that for specific reasons. It is simply the infrastructure owner and a tenant on that network in a non-exclusive basis.
Jeff, could you comment, are people, communities, the utility making revenue on that, or are they just making their bond payments on these arrangements?
They're getting the network. They're building a network for themselves.
Okay,
now,
so they're operating, they own and operate the network.
They don't, no, beg your pardon. They build a network for their own internal operational needs, infrastructure that they need to be able to adopt and offer to the benefits of smart grid technologies, both for their internal operations and then for their ratepayers. The problem with fiber optic networks is that they are obviously expensive, often prohibitively so. But the opportunity for them to turn a cost center into a revenue generating asset by making excess capacity on that fiber available on a non-exclusive basis to service providers who then take the responsibility and all of the competitive market share risk of being a service provider, then it allows for these networks to be deployed at a pace that they would not or could not on their own. So again, it's not a partnership. We're building infrastructure. We have to build this. If we did it on our own, we'd be covering, the utility, covering the entire cost. The ratepayers would be covering the entire cost on their own. And obviously we'd have to build it out at a slower pace because of the expense. But when we're able to turn that into a revenue generating asset, we now take that burden, or a lot of that burden, away from our ratepayers. And we're getting the revenue from the service providers, allowing us to then build faster and at a larger footprint than we otherwise would on our own. It's a great benefit on many levels.
Great, thank you, sir. And we're going to go, I think, and hopefully we're not going to catch Gigi off guard, but we're going to ask her to come on to do a close here. I see some additional questions, and some of those as we go down the line in this webinar series, when we start to talk about engineering costs and feasibility, we'll be able to cover those in detail. So make sure you join us in May for that. Gigi, do you want to close us out?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank Jeff, Krista, Ellie, and Cynthia for just a great webinar. And Bill, you did a masterful job at moderating. I know we could have gone for at least another hour or more. So this will be archived, which is terrific, on the AAPB website and also on the Benton website. Also want to just tell people the next two dates and topics for the next two webinars: May 14th, 12 to 1, determining roles and partnerships, and June 11th, 12 to 1, implementation, building and operating the network. And I'm hoping that this can, there will be a series beyond 3 of these. So stay tuned. And again, please do sign up for our announcements on the AAPB website. And thank you again to everybody and for everybody for coming.